Morning.
Good morning.
Let's go ahead and pray, and then we will get started this morning on Ecclesiastes 5. Lord, thank you so much just for this time. Thank you, Lord, for your grace and your word and your truth. Pray, God, that this would be productive and beneficial, and that overall, Lord, you would be glorified. We give you the praise, and we thank you so much for who you are and for what you do. For it's in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's talk about what we discussed from last week, the highlights of what we discussed previously. It says, Koheleth mentioned that the crushing of those who have little influence and resources will always be a reality due to the activities of humankind. Last week we had went through Ecclesiastes chapter 5 in the preceding verses, and it discussed essentially. Let me turn there for just a second. Oh boy. It discussed the qualities of oppression. That if you see the oppression and the poor and the denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked or amazed at the sight of what you see. Right? Koheleth mentioned that there will always be those who have more authority and keep those who are under them. And threaten those who are under them. In other words, they'll just be following orders. That's kind of the idea here. I mentioned the Milgram experiment last week, and how individuals who have authority are able to subjugate individuals who are below them, right, to do things that they may have not have done otherwise. And Koheleth brings this out. Lastly, the king always profits from the land that they govern over for his own purposes and objectives. If the king has a perspective, a proper perspective, then those who are under that king's rule will be able to experience, prosperity, freedom, all of these things. However, if the king is serving himself, if the authority or the governing authority is serving themselves for their own purposes, he will crush those, particularly those who are poor and do not have any resources or influence themselves. Okay. Let's continue in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 or chapter 5, verse 10. We're looking at the following statement of Koheleth. He who loves money will not be satisfied with it, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. He who loves money. Now, this is not a statement concerning not to make any, nor is it a pejorative of those of discouraging people to become wealthy. Based upon the words themselves that Koheleth uses, this is talking about a particular person. Okay. A particular person with a particular disposition. How do I know this? He who loves, let's talk about this particular phrase here. This Hebrew word is Ahab. This occurs 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay. It is translated love or loves, right, in some respects. And it is talking about the one who has an affectionate or favorable disposition or attitude towards someone or something, right? So it could be he who loves his wife, he who loves his dog, he who loves his neighbor, things like that. Okay. This word is in the qual stem. It is an active participle, and there are two types. There's 2 types of uses for this particular participle that's being used by Koheleth here. It could either be used to modify a noun that is a person, place, or thing, or it could be used essentially as an adjective, a descriptor. Okay. So this particular phrase, Ahab, or word here, is used to describe or emphasize or highlight a certain type of person who has a certain type of disposition. In this case, the text here says, he who loves money, the lover of money, right? Those who have an affectionate disposition or attitude towards this particular resource. He talks about the outcome of this individual, this particular type of person, this person who adores money, who loves it. They can't get enough of it. Will not be satisfied. This is the Hebrew word saba, and it occurs 4 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. In some respects, we've already talked about this word before. We've seen this word here in various passages. For example, in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 8, Koheleth mentions this. It says, all things are wearisome, burdensome. Man is not able to speak of it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. The eye never gets its fill, right? Or ever gets, or is not satiated. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 8, concerning the man without a two or a dependent, it says, there was a certain man without a dependent, neither having a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches. We talked about this particular phrase here. And he never asked, he never considered, right? And for who am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure, right? That God desires us to enjoy what we have, right? Rather than living for this, that, or the other. It says this too is useless, and it is a grievous task. Okay? Again, recall this word emphasizes a person's satiety or a person's fulfillment in something, right? This is the whole goal. It could either mean a physical appetite, like literally you're hungry and you satiate yourself with food, beverage, things like that, or it could be a personal fulfillment or longing of something. So what is the conclusion here? Koheleth mentions to the congregation of Israel that the type of people who love silver, literally silver in this case, he who loves silver, or the lover of money, or those who seek abundance, that is, those types of individuals, those individuals who have a certain characteristic or disposition about themselves that comes from gain or revenue, as to answer the question, why do I exist? These are these type of people. When you ask them the question, why do they exist? They answer like this. I exist to make dollars and cents. That's it. Money makes the world go round, and I want to be the one that cranks the wheel, right? That's the idea. They will never be satisfied with this, which makes their overall perspective empty, as he mentions in verse 10. He who loves money will not be satisfied or satiated with money, nor he who loves abundance with his income, for this too is vanity. It's so interesting. They never say that's enough. They never say that, right? Chapter 5, verse 11. Koheleth continues his thought concerning the individual who loves money or who loves abundance. By the way, this thought carries all the way, I believe, to the end of the chapter. Okay? In verse 11, he says, when good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? Now, when I was going through this text, there was a couple of words that were tripping me up here. What does owners mean? Does it mean owners of the good things, owners of those who consume them? What owners are we talking about? Let's take a look at some of the text here. It says those who consume them is the Hebrew word akal. Akal. It occurs 15 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. It means to eat, that is to physically eat, to devour something or to consume something, to take in something. It emphasizes a person who is highly involved with the activity of ingestion. That includes figurative, right? For instance, we see this in the book of Ecclesiastes where it says in the previous chapter where a person folds his hands together and eats his self or his hands and consumes his own hand, figuratively speaking. And it's also used in eating and consumption of food and things like that. Okay. Once again, this word is in the qual stem and is an active participle as well. And again, this it could either be used as a noun to modify a noun or a substantive, which could be an adjective. And once more, just like the phrase before, he who loves money, he who loves abundance, is talking about a particular type of person. We'll talk about this particular type of person in a minute, okay? Because I believe that there's some context we need to consider. But nevertheless, those who consume them impact those who love money, right? Continuing his thought here, let's look at a couple of more words here. Advantage. It says, when good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage? What is the outcome? What is the success? Okay. This word is used 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. This particular Hebrew word, it could be used, it could be translated as skill when it's talking about a person's abilities. Okay? What they can do, how they can perform. It could be translated success in terms of one's personal endeavors, okay, and their objectives. Or it could be translated as profit in terms of a person's resources. Okay? In the context of Koheleth's statement, again, it's interesting that he uses this word when it refers to money. What is the advantage, or literally the profit, of a person who has individuals who are just consumers? When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage or the profit, the success to the owners, except to look on? This is interesting. Let's look at the term owners. Baal is the Hebrew word. 7 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, it could be translated owners, possessors of something, or even husband, in terms of a person's vocation in that role. Okay? In the context of Ecclesiastes, this is one who acquires either resources or is in a marital relationship. However, in the book of Ecclesiastes, it may concern what was known as the owner or the master of the house. Okay? In the context or culture of the Hebrew of the Hebrew scriptures, you had individuals who had owners, indentured servants, right? You could say that Koheleth was one of them, right? He was the king of Israel. He had lots of servants, lots of attendees, right? Things like that. He was the owner or the master of his own household and how it got ran and things like that. Think of Potiphar, right? And Joseph, right? Potiphar was the master of the house. He was the owner, the administrator of the house, and gave charge to Joseph to care for his goods and things around his house. So, What does this mean? One last phrase I want to look at, rahith, to look on. This is interesting. This is the only time this word occurs in the entire Hebrew scriptures, rahith, to look on, at the end of verse 11. This root word is the word ra'ah. We talked about this word before, right? This is looking at something and expecting it, seeing it to be genuine, inspecting its quality, right? This word involves a person using their physical eyes to see and fixate on a particular thing, okay, or a particular object. So what does this phrase mean? What does it mean when he says, uh, uh, when good things increase, those who consume them increase? So what is the advantage to the owners except to look on? You mentioned that you see that he writes this in a rhetorical question, right? The answer is self-evident here. Let's put all this together. This is not a good thing, okay, that Koheleth is mentioning. Koheleth mentions that because of this individual's disposition or their attitude towards money, towards silver, towards resources, that the only advantage is not to look upon these individuals who are consuming them under the house that he has, that it benefits them, but the only profit or only advantage for this master or owner is to watch those who consume them. To make sure they don't spend too much or they don't consume too much. Because after all, that's his money, right? To make sure they're not taking too much from him. Not to look on his money or his things, but to look on them. They don't trust anyone. That's the point. These individuals who work for them, you would think that they would have trust, confidence in the people who work for them, but they don't, right? Because of their disposition. Now, some things we ought to consider regarding Koheleth's analysis concerning this text. First of all, the history concerning Koheleth's time period versus our time period. It's really difficult for us we almost have to force ourselves to look at this text outside of our culture. Because remember, in the time of the Hebrew scriptures, when we talk about when a person is poor or when a person is, without substance, in our culture, when we talk about poor, that person who's poor that we talk about owns 2 cars, right? And is able to have smartphones, right? And have subscriptions to Netflix. That's not the poor here, okay? When a person who was a master of the house had indentured servants that lived with them, they were destitute. It was where you were going to get your next meal. Life was on the line, okay? We never experienced anything like this. So history, again, ought to be considered. When a person does this who has the love of money and treats individuals like this is very unfortunate. Also, the culture as well. Again, indentured servitude was a part of this culture as well. If you have a person who has a love of money, you could almost bet that they would mistreat those who serve them. This is a problem, according to Koheleth, this perspective. Again, not wealth, that's not the issue, but the favorable disposition, the focus towards it, that's the issue. Okay? Koheleth continues in verse 12. Okay? He says, the sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. This is somewhat proverbial of Koheleth that he's writing. Not too much observation here, other than to make this statement that Koheleth, based upon how he writes this, is contrasting between a man's working sleep, which he describes as pleasant or sweet. That's the literal translation here. And his physical appetite. That it, even if the working man eats little or much, doesn't matter the consumption of his meal, he's still able to sleep. Whereas the rich man, that is the one who loves money, even though his belly is full, he's satiated, he should be snoring, right? Based upon his consumption of his meal. He cannot sleep. It is impossible for him to sleep because he's concerned about the money he possesses, and more importantly, the people who are around him that could threaten that. Koheleth sums up this statement in verse 13, or this, well, he doesn't conclude the thought, but he sums it up. He's getting ready to emphasize it a little more, but he sums it up in verse 13. There is a grievous evil which I have seen under the sun, tehatsames, right? The activity of humanity here. Riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. To his hurt. Let's take a look at the word hoarded here. This Hebrew word is samar. It occurs 9 times, by the way, in a book of Ecclesiastes, and literally it means to keep or to guard something, right? Something or someone or whatever, right? This Hebrew word is used figuratively and non-figuratively, right? And again, we've seen this word before. For instance, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 6, concerning the activities of humanity that Koheleth lists out, an event or a time to search, and an event to give up as lost, a time to keep, a time to samar, and a time to throw away, right? To literally keep possessions, or a time to give them up, to let them go, right? Especially during times of living and of passing away, right? When someone's living, they keep things, keepsakes, things like that, things that are valuable. But when one passes away, those things either get discarded or get, reused somewhere, things like that. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 1, Koheleth, that is Solomon, uses this phrase or uses this word in an idiom. We talked about this: guard your steps or watch your feet, right? As you go to the house of God to draw near to listen, rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know they are doing evil, right? And then Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8, in that passage that we looked at last week, that an official watches over or keeps another official, right? If this official doesn't do what they're told, your head is on the line. Right? So, what is Koheleth's point here? There's a grievous evil which I've seen under the sun, with the activities of humanity, riches being kept, guarded, held, not living with the attitude or perspective of an open hand, but trying to live with a closed hand and fighting everyone, right? You can't get any of this. This is mine, right? Koheleth's observation mentioned that this is grievous trouble for the person who has a perspective of loving money. Because Koheleth, by the language, seems to suggest that this physically hurts or torments an individual. Have you ever met an individual like this? Or have heard of an individual like this who has riches and they are the most miserable people on the face of the planet, on the face of the land? They're miserable. Why are you so miserable? Koheleth seems to suggest that it's the perspective that they have, the outlook. We get to verse 14. Koheleth, again, as to underscore his particular point, it seems this happens with Hebrew literature and writing, right? We can't just make the point once. We gotta emphasize it a couple times, right? So that we get it, right? Koheleth seems to bring this up again in verse 14, but now he's going to use an example, shall we say, a practical example, right? He says, when those riches of the man who has this love of money were lost through a bad investment, and he had fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him. Interesting statement. Very, very brief, but it's fascinating based upon the discourse that we're talking about. Koheleth continues discussing the rich man and his riches, that is his perspective from the previous verse, right? Verse 13. That how these riches were lost through a bad occupation or a business. I know the word's translated investment, but it literally means occupation or business or something like that, right? So basically a bad transaction, bad business venture, things like that. And he fathered a son, right? And there was nothing to hand or support his son. Now, which one is more important? Which one would you rather invest in? According to Koheleth, the son who not only needs, is the one who's, especially a firstborn, right? The one who gets all of the things that you have. But not only that, to take care of the physical needs of this individual, to pass on something for him, and there was nothing to support or hand his son. He left his son high and dry due to his perspective. The main point that Koheleth brings up in this scenario, due to this man's outlook or perspective of ascertaining more money for himself, it's not necessarily the quote unquote investment that's the issue. It is his outlook that's the issue. Because he wants more money for himself, he made a poor business decision and lost it all completely. He's not satisfied with what he's got. Hey, we're good. I'm up. We're here. His perspective is access. He could have invested his riches in his son to care for him and provide for his needs, but because of his outlook, he overlooked that. That's the point here. Now we get to the heart of this particular issue that Koheleth has. Again, this is an outlook book, right? So Koheleth is adjusting the perspective of those whom he's writing to, specifically the congregation of Israel, telling them how important this is. Verses 15 to 18. As he has come naked from his mother's womb, so he will return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. This is the perspective of a person who loves money or loves abundance, thinking that they can take it with them, almost like. They're not going to be able to do that. They can try as hard as they want. He says, this also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus will he die. He came in with nothing, he will leave with nothing. So, what's the point of accumulating all of this stuff to hoard it for yourself if you can't take it with you? What is the point? He says, what is an advantage to him who toils for the wind? Oh, what a statement. You're not chasing after it. You're working for it now. You're toiling for the wind. You can't grasp it, you can't hold it. The last statement he talks about is throughout his life, he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. Koheleth informed the congregation of Israel concerning what the rich man in his perspective doesn't get. He doesn't get this, that a person cannot take all the silver with them. It's kind of that phrase, whoever dies with the most toys still dies. That's the idea. It's like those old pharaohs that buried all of their riches and wealth with them, and then that hundreds of thousands of years later, archaeologists come and all you see is a skeleton with riches around them. They didn't take it with them. It will remain here. And as a result, there is no advantage or profit for the rich man to guard his wealth in terms of his perspective. Now, he mentions at the end of this is that that is, throughout his life, he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. We need to talk about these. What does it mean that he eats in darkness? What does that mean exactly? Let's take a look at a couple of phrases here. Kosek is the word here for darkness. Okay? It occurs 80 times in the Hebrew scriptures, 6 times in the book of Ecclesiastes here. It's translated darkness or obscurity, right? Again, we've seen this word before in various chapters. For instance, in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 13 and 14, concerning his observation of wisdom, Koheleth writes, and I saw that wisdom excels folly, just as light excels darkness. Right? The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. We talked about this, that this isn't just any old wisdom. This is talking about the wisdom of God, right? That those who acknowledge God and his wisdom walk clearly. They see clearly. As those who reject it, they don't want anything to do with it. They fumble around, right? In darkness. They walk in darkness. Yet I know that one fate befalls both of them, right? Let's look at the word vexation. So if darkness is their perspective, they do not acknowledge or do not perceive the wisdom of God. If they have this darkness, the result is in verse 17, that they eat in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. Let me go back to vexation. Kaas is the word for vexation, occurs twice in the book of Ecclesiastes. It is translated vexation or anger, right? This word is associated with Rabbah in the phrase here that means great vexation, great, massive, exceeding. This verb is written in what is known as the sequential perfect, wikatal. So we have the jussive, we have the passive, verb passive. What is the sequential perfect? This word connects to an earlier verb or to form in either sequence of time or sequence of thought. So in this particular context here, what Koheleth is doing, I'll show you this in a minute. He's connected this with the earlier verb, that is the word eats, to discuss the type of thought process this individual has. All right, it's not just a statement of being or a state of being that this individual is. We're seeing the sequence of thought to his life, how he views it, how he observes it, how he sees it overall. Okay. So just as an example here in verse 17, we see the verb here, he eats, right? This is the imperfect, and then the sequential perfect comes after that. So he eats with vexation. Not that he's just mad about a particular subject. He is mad about his life overall. He's vexed about his life entirely. Okay? That's kind of the idea. Not just a particular event, but his process of thought, his thinking, his understanding. The word sickness is holly. It occurs twice in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it emphasizes some physical illness or malady or something like that. Something physical. So think about a person who's always anxious, right? And they're always overwhelmed, they're heavy burdened, they're with, they're just overall just miserable. They literally make themselves sick. And then we have the word anger, kesef. Not quisep, kesef. This word is a noun. This underscores this individual or this person's state. This Hebrew word occurs once in the book of Ecclesiastes, that is here in this text. It is translated wrath or anger, and this word is used of God when it talks about his wrath that either he does when he judges the nation of Israel or other nations, or it also refers to the time of Jacob's trouble too. Wrath, destruction, all over the place, right? Hostility, violence, things like that. And it's used of humanity. Now, whenever it's used of humanity, it is never good. Ever. Ever. Okay? This is the type of anger that Koheleth would say that a fool exhibits. Okay? So, what is the overall statement of that Koheleth is making? Koheleth informed the reader that if a person is wealthy and has this perspective, again, this is not about the wealth of an individual. This is about the wealth of an individual and their outlook. Okay? They will obscure themselves from the proper perspective. They will walk in darkness. That's what this means. The result of this, because they're not able to rest, they don't trust anybody. Their outlook is their outlook is poor. This will result in them becoming extremely cynical about life. I mean, if they spend a nickel, they have an aneurysm, right? If someone else, you don't even think about someone else spending anything. And they may even become hostile to others overall. That is the point here. As a matter of fact, before I close out here, even the Greek scriptures, Jesus mentions this somewhat in the underscoring this in concerning the love of money, that you cannot serve both God and wealth. He mentions this too, underscores this. But I want to take a look at Peter's words. Paul's words. Paul's words in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 6. This reminds me of Koheleth and his statement that he mentions here. Koheleth, it's almost very similar to what Paul mentions here to Timothy. I'll start at verse 3, and we'll finish here. If anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, and with the doctrine conforming to godliness, he is conceited and understands nothing. But he has a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abusive language, evil suspicions, and constant friction between men of depraved mind and deprived of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. But godliness is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. Verse 7, for we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. Doesn't that sound familiar? Just like Koheleth. For if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich, that is, he who loves money, fall into temptation and the snare of many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many sorrows. That is a great summation of what Koheleth has taught us in Ecclesiastes 5, right? To have the love of money and an outlook is like this is problematic. Let's go ahead and pray. We will continue. I thought I was going to finish chapter 5 this week, but as you can see, I didn't. So we will finish up chapter 5 next week. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for reminding us of the perspective that we are to have, that we are not to have an outlook of longing for temporal things. That includes the resources here, but that we should long for things eternal, to have a proper perspective of money, to live our lives with an open hand. We are all very wealthy here in this room, comparative to the time of Solomon and most individuals there. May we not live for money, but may we live to fear you. Thank you so much, Lord, for it's in your son's name.